There are many games that will go down in history as some of the greatest ever made. Minecraft, the Mario series, Metroid, the Zelda series, and while all of these games are amazing and well made, I don't think any game will top the game I will be talking about today in terms of replayability, entertainment value, and sheer amount of content. Of course, the game I'm talking about is Terraria. I want to go over some of the game's progression and tell you why, in my opinion, it's one of the best games ever made. Since its initial release in 2011 as a simple 2D sandbox game with 3 bosses to how the game is today, Terraria has stayed true to its original design. However, the game has improved over the years with different hotfixes and updates, which have added over 20 bosses, 26 NPCs, and 547 different unique weapons. Throughout the entirety of this video, I want to show you how over 10 years of dedication and hard work, Relogic have created one of the best games of all time. Terraria is a 2D survival sandbox game that was made by a small team based in Indiana called Relogic. Terraria has currently sold over 35 million copies worldwide, making it the 14th best-selling video game of all time. In the game, there are currently over 20 bosses that you can fight. The thing that makes fighting these bosses interesting is the classes that you can choose from in the game. You don't have to stick with one class for your whole playthrough though, and it's pretty easy to swap between them midway through. The 4 main classes are Melee, where you use swords and close-range weapons, Ranger, where you use bows and guns, Mage, where you use staffs and magic books, and Summoner, where you use minions to fight for you. While I'm not going to go through everything in the game, I'll talk about the main stages of the game, starting with the early game and pre-hard mode. When you first join a Terraria world, you spawn with 3 basic tools, these being a sword, a pickaxe, and an axe. These are used for fighting enemies, gathering ores, and cutting down trees. A big part of Terraria are the NPCs, who spawn in suitable housing when certain requirements are met in the game. For example, a demolitionist will move in when you've got bombs or dynamite in your inventory, and the merchant will spawn in when you've got 50 silver. The first boss you'll most likely encounter is the Eye of Cthulhu. This boss is a giant eye that follows the player around, and when it's taken down to half health, it develops a mouth and starts charging at the player. After Eye of Cthulhu, the next boss that you'll fight is Eater of Worlds. This boss is a giant worm that launches itself at the player. The Eater of Worlds is made up from different sections. When a section is destroyed, the Eater of Worlds becomes 2 smaller worms. After every section has been destroyed, the boss has been defeated. It drops items that can be crafted into armor that can be used for the next boss. This boss is called Skeletron. Skeletron is a giant skull with 2 arms that follows the player and hits them with its hands. Once it's defeated, you can loot the dungeon, which has a lot of weapons that will be useful for hard mode. In order to get to hard mode, where there are new bosses, items, and weapons, you must defeat the Wall of Flesh in the underworld. This boss is a giant wall with 2 eyes and a mouth that moves rapidly and shoots lasers at the player. A lot of preparation must be done for this boss, as it starts to get faster the more health it loses, so you'll need a runway to get away from it. Now that you're in hard mode, your current armor and weapons are terrible, and do little to no damage to hard mode enemies. Luckily, many of your pre-hard mode weapons can be turned into hard mode weapons, and getting hard mode armor and weapons is a lot easier than pre-hard mode. In order to get better armor for hard mode, you need to get one of the 3 new hard mode ores armor set. This armor will give you a good chance against the first 3 bosses of hard mode, the Destroyer, the Twins, and Skeletron Prime. These 3 bosses collectively make up the mechanical bosses, which are just more difficult versions of pre-hard mode bosses. The Destroyer is based off the Eater of Worlds, the Twins are harder versions of the Eye of Cthulhu, and Skeletron Prime is a harder version of Skeletron. When all 3 of the mechanical bosses have been defeated, the message, "The jungle grows restless," will pop up. This means that the next boss can now be summoned. This boss is called Plantera, and is summoned by destroying a pink bulb that spawns in the underground jungle. Plantera is a giant plant that shoots seeds and spiky balls at the player, and in its second form releases tentacles that try to grab you. The way to defeat Plantera is by circling around it, as it's quite slow. Once Plantera is defeated, you'll move on to Golem. This boss is found at the end of a large jungle temple, which is full of traps and enemies that try to kill you. This boss is really easy. It has hands that detach and punch the player, and in its second form, its head comes off and shoots lasers at the player through its eyes. After Golem is defeated, 4 worshippers will spawn at the dungeon. When they are killed, the lunatic cultist will spawn. The cultist is a pretty big step up from Golem, and I almost always have trouble with this boss. His attacks deal a lot of damage, and it's almost always moving, making it difficult to aim. After the cultist is defeated, 4 pillars will spawn in your world. Each pillar corresponds to each class, which I mentioned at the start of the video, these being Melee, Ranger, Mage, and Summoner. Different enemies spawn at each pillar, and you have to kill 100 of these enemies before the central pillar can be destroyed. When the pillar is destroyed, it will drop a number of fragments that can be used to craft weapons of each class. After destroying the 4th and final pillar, a message will appear on screen saying impending doom is approaching. This is the message that shows before the Moonlord, the final boss of Terraria spawns. The Moonlord has almost every different kind of attack thinkable, a beam that can go through walls, exploding bolts that home in on the player, even a life-stealing tentacle that leeches onto the player, draining their health. The Moonlord has it all. Now that I'm done talking about the progression of Terraria, let's talk about why I think the game is a masterpiece. First of all, I think that the way that you progress through the game is so well paced, as there are limits on how powerful you can be at one time. The crafting system in this game is also really extensive. Most items require specific crafting stations to be made. This makes the game balanced, and means you can't get items that are not available to you at that point in time. The soundtrack is upbeat and easy to listen to. There are hundreds of enemies and items that you can collect, and one playthrough will be completely different than the last, which gives Terraria really good replay value. Being able to choose specific classes to use when playing is great, as it means that you can pick different accessories and weapons to make using that class easier. Each boss is different, and it's required to learn its attack patterns in order to beat it. Every boss is important, and while there were some that I didn't mention, each one has something that is important for the progression of the game, which gives a sense of improvement when playing. The sheer amount of content in this game is incredible, and the replayability is astounding. I never find myself getting bored of Terraria, as there are still things I'm yet to do in the game despite me having already played it for almost 6 years. It's incredible how much Relogic have managed to pack into such a seemingly simple game. How the art in the game, despite being pixel art, is so detailed and animated. The fact that there are hundreds of weapons made for 4 different classes and over 20 bosses in the game as of right now just shows the dedication of the Relogic team. Terraria is an amazing game, and I highly suggest that you start playing it if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you haven't already, check out my last video about the history of Mario. I got a new microphone, so the sound quality hopefully isn't as bad as the last videos. Feel free to leave a comment if you want, and I'll see you later.